so much. As Katie mentioned, I've written another book called Colorado Women History, and that was done in 2012. And I did a little bit of World War II in that book, but it wasn't until I interviewed a former Army nurse that I really became very interested in World War II and telling the women's stories. So that became the result of Colorado Women in World War II. Now, 4 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, a woman with the Denver Women's Press Club predicted that war would come for the United States and that its long arm would reach into the lives of all Americans. She warned club members that the coming war will not be a man's war at the front. It will be a civilian war reaching into every kitchen and nursery. It will be a war not only of bombs, but also of butter. Not only of Maginot Lines, but also of morale. It will be a war which leaves no room for hysteria and helplessness, snobbishness and intolerances. And reach it did. In the huge numbers of drafted and enlisted loved ones, in the unprecedented number of women in the armed forces, in the availability of new job opportunities, and in the form of government mandates, reactions, and regulations. Now, because of Colorado's landlocked location, it became very popular for government agencies and defense plants, because of course we were far from what might have been bombed during the war. And one of the first places that was established was in 1941, before the attack, was the Denver Ordinance plant. Now, I have divided the book into 3 parts: women in the military, women in the defense plants, and then women on the home front. So this presentation will follow that same order. Nationwide, over 358 women served in the military. They served in all of the branches, including the Women's Air Force service pilots, who were not considered military at the time, but then decades after the war were given military status. So I have included them as part of the military area. In 1941, our number of Army nurses and Navy nurses throughout the United States numbered like 1,500. Well, obviously we knew we were going to need thousands and thousands more. So the government issued a mandate for every state to have a certain quota of registered nurses that would agree to join the military if they were needed. And of course they were. Colorado's requirement was 500 nurses. Althea Williams was working at Poudre Valley Hospital when the attack happened at Pearl Harbor. Now, when they heard about it, they originally thought the newscast, the radio cast, was simply another War of the Worlds broadcast. And of course, they found out it was not that at all. It was, the true story of the attack. So she immediately joined the Army Nurse Corps, was sent down to Fitzsimmons to work. She's standing on the roof there, and then was later sent out to the Pacific. Now, in the 18 months that she worked out there, served as a nurse, she said they got so busy that all R&R was canceled. So by the end of the war, she had over, hundreds of days of R&R. But she said, I don't have any complaints. She said, they asked us to serve, and we served. And I served because my boyfriends, brothers, uncles, all of our male friends were being drafted and were out there fighting. And they deserved the best medical care. The other woman, Leela Allen, is the Army nurse that I met in Windsor. She turns 100 tomorrow. And so she's one of my sweethearts and kind of like a second mom to me. But anyhow, she was graduating from nursing school in Tennessee, and the Army recruiters came and said, if you nurses don't sign up for the Army Nurse Corps, we're going to have to draft nurses. And of course, that would be an awful stain on the reputation of nurses in America. So they swallowed that and signed up, and they said, where do you want to be stationed for your basic training? And they thought, well, Colorado sounds great because we can meet Indians. Everybody's naive. And so they were sent to Lowry, where she did her basic training. And then she was sent to Texas, where she actually met her future husband the first day she was there. He was with the Armored Tank Divisions. And he ended up kind of following her through Europe, just the way it worked out. But She ended up serving over in France and Germany. She was sent over the English Channel in August of 1944. So she was one of those that actually was still able to see the parachute strings hanging from the trees and seeing the debris littering the beaches of Normandy and that whole area. Later, as the war was coming to a close, she and her unit was stationed outside of Buchenwald concentration camp, and they actually were brought through to view the concentration camp 3 days after it was liberated. So you can imagine what an impact that has made on her life. Now the Army, as well as the Navy, also had evacuation nurses. And so Betty Berry was one of those. And on the ship going from California out to the Pacific and the islands, she said she wasn't worried about anything. You know, they had to do little maneuvers to avoid the submarines and everything. And she said, I wasn't worried. I just sat on the top deck and continued knitting. She also said when she was stationed out there in the Pacific, there was a time where she wasn't on a flight and they had an air raid siren go off. And so they all had to jump into the ditches and the trenches that they had dug. And the nurses all jumped in there. And as soon as they did, they saw the big python in the trench with them. So fortunately, the MPs also jumped in and they shot the python. And after they came out and everything, she's like, what are you going to do with that dead snake? And they said, nothing, we don't want anything to do with it. And she said, can I have it? And they said, sure. So she ended up having a purse and shoes made out of this python. Can you imagine if you're a granddaughter and you hear that story from grandma? That's just pretty amazing. As I said, the Navy Nurse Corps also had air evacuation. The first ones went into Okinawa and took the men back from Iwo Jima, from that field. So the women had to prove that they could swim like 440 yards. They could drag somebody in the water 200 yards. They knew how to handle an unpressurized cabin because that's what they would have had for their nursing and all. And if they passed that, they were selected as a Navy Nurse Corps. Now Jackie Jaquette flew from Kwajalein to Okinawa. It was an 8-hour flight. So at 1:30 in the morning, she would get up, don her green nylon uniform and her baseball cap, get met by a jeep, taken down to the airstrip. She'd meet her medical corpsman, and they would get on the plane and fly out. On the 8-hour flight out there, they would make their sandwiches, check all their medicines and the supplies and all that. Once they landed at Okinawa, they had about 30 minutes to 45 minutes to load 30 wounded onto the airplane. You can see there these tiers of cots, and there were 4 tiers on either side of the airplane. Then also in the back there were a number of seats for those wounded who could actually sit up. And as I said, it was unpressurized cabins, so at one point Jackie had this one guy who had a horrible chest injury, and she went up to the front and asked the pilot, could he fly lower? And he said, ma'am, I will skim the water if that's what it takes to get this guy home safely. So, you know, they were absolutely wonderful pilots. Omi Halder also was one from later the Denver area. And she said she made sure that she talked to the men, offered to make phone calls once they landed, especially for those who had perhaps lost a limb. You can imagine how upsetting that would be to make that phone call. Now the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Women's Army Corps ended up having the most number of women in the armed forces. Oleta Crane was an African-American woman who was originally from Oklahoma. She started working at the Denver Ordinance plant, and then she saw an advertisement saying, women can help win the war, join the Army band. And she said, well, this is great. I play the cornet and the saxophone. I'll join up. So she enlisted, and then once she enlisted and got to basic training in Fort Des Moines, Iowa, found out that the band was only for white women, not for African Americans. So she ended up going through officer training school and became a lieutenant But they did end up with 5 different women Army Corps bands. One of them was labeled a colored unit, because that was the terminology then, for African American soldiers. She ended up serving over 20 years in the military, and then served with the Department of Labor for women's issues. She's a member of our Women's Colorado Hall of Fame. Now, Sunshine Cloud Smith was a Southern Ute who enlisted in the WWII and became a surgical technician in upstate New York. Later, after the war, she went back to the reservation in southwest Colorado and became a very important tribal leader. Now, as you're probably familiar, Amachi was one of the 10 relocation camps for Japanese Americans that were removed from the West Coast by the Executive Order 9066. Colorado had about 77,000 Japanese Americans from Southern California that were moved to Colorado. The women there worked in various capacities, but they also, by 1943, those internees were allowed to leave the camps throughout the United States, any of the 10, if they had, quote unquote, a worthwhile job. So many of them got jobs at the defense plants. Iris Watanabe joined the WWII, and Sue Agato, who was a Colorado resident. We did not intern our own Japanese Americans. She and the 2 of them joined the Women's Army Corps and were sent to Fort Snelling, where they became translators in the Japanese language for the Corps. Photography was one area that women really kind of started dominating. The Lowry Airfield had a huge photography training school, and Bernice Moran was one of those. She learned how to develop her own film, take apart and repair the cameras, all those kinds of things that are necessary. Now, the WWIIs were the women accepted for voluntary emergency service. We always love to use acronyms, especially the military. So the WWIIs were originally not allowed to leave the United States for duty stations, but by 1940, late 43, early 44, they were allowed to serve in Bermuda, the Caribbean, Alaska, and Hawaii. So many of them were able to do that. Now, at the University of Colorado in Boulder, they had a men's Japanese language school and a women's Japanese language school for Navy personnel. And this was a 10-month program that was very immersive. After the first week, they didn't speak anything but Japanese in the school. So you can imagine, the stress of that. The men went on to the Pacific to be translators. The women were generally sent to Washington, D.C., where they were translators and possibly code analysis. Obviously, paperwork. The government runs on paperwork. The military runs on paperwork. And so women were oftentimes assigned stenography and typists and dictation and all of those things. Edna Guise, who was a law school graduate, joined the Navy, and she was assigned to Washington, D.C. in the Bureau of Naval Personnel, where she handled the claims for casualty and death benefits. There were also WWIIs that served as link trainers. Now, the link is a air simulator. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And so there on the far right is Elaine Watkins, and she was a teacher in Denver. So the Navy, in their wisdom, made her an instructor on the link trainer. Other women served as other instructors. They served as parachute riggers, mechanics, things like that. There's a better picture later, but these 2, yeah, you can see that. These 2 women are training another WWII on the link trainer. It was also called the blue box, because as you'll see, it'll come up in a minute. So that's what the WWIIs did. Now, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or the Wasp, were used to free male pilots for combat duty. And about just over 1,000 were accepted into the program, not into the program, more were accepted, but that actually completed the program. They had to be licensed pilots before they applied, and then they were sent to Sweetwater, Texas, where they were trained with the same training as the male pilots that were training at other bases. The problem is that the women didn't have uniforms to help them in training classes. This is a list of the women who considered themselves Coloradoans during the war. None of those are surviving today. So this is the link trainer. You can see why it's called the blue box. And you would sit in there and an instructor outside would tell you to do X, Y, and Z. This would move in certain directions and you would have to deal with all of that. So the women didn't have uniforms. So what they did is they gave the women used mechanics overalls, sizes 42 to 48. Well, you can see that these women do not fill these uniforms, okay? So they're rolling up the sleeves, they're cinching it up here, they're rolling the pant leg. And these cause problems during training. They were sometimes in an airplane. I'll show you a picture of this one woman, and she was up, she was gonna put her plane into a spin. And so just before she decided to initiate her first spin, she looked down and her harness was unbuckled. Well, she knew, you're not going to forget to do that. That's the first thing you check before you check even all the instruments, that you're buckled in. So she figured her sleeve caught the buckle and opened it up. Well, she's in an open cockpit. Not a good idea. This is Peggy McCaffrey, who was raised in Montrose and joined the Wasp, and later came back to Montrose and was a teacher and all. She was once up in an airplane. Peggy Moynihan was her unmarried name, and it wasn't flying right. She all of a sudden was starting to dive bomb rather than going up. So she popped the stick and nothing happened. She popped the stick again, nothing happened. She's still spiraling towards Earth. She pops it again and finally is able to get it up and out. So she figures, something's going wrong with this airplane. She finds a safe place to land, lands, gets out, runs her hand along the airfoil, and finds a big wad of bubble gum. Oh. So she peels that off, tosses it, puts her gloves back on, and flies off. Everything's fine. Now, whether or not that was an intentional act of sabotage on a mechanic's end or not, you don't know. Or just he's stuck it there and, I'll come back and get it. But he didn't. The women in the Wasp did various things. They ferried planes from one area to the country to another. They also, like Peggy did, tested new aircraft as well as aircraft that had been repaired. And that's what she was doing on that particular one. It had been damaged, it was here in the United States, so it was repaired. They said that oftentimes the women would, if they're going to take up one of these repaired planes, they would ask the mechanic to go on the test ride with them. Oh, yeah. So, as I said, in 1977, the women were accepted as having done military service and were given veterans status. Then in 2010, they were presented the Congressional Gold Medal for their war efforts. And that was, of course, President Obama at the time. Now, SPAR stands for Semper Paratus, Always Ready. That's the motto of the Coast Guard. And they were often confused with the Navy women because the uniforms were so similar. They were the only group of women that were actually trained at the military academy for the Coast Guard. The other women were trained at old cavalry bases, air bases, and things like that. Now, Jane Silverstein was a licensed architect in Colorado, in Denver. She had her own company. And actually, as the war began, she started designing war housing for defense plant workers. And then she joined the SPAR and was sent to New York, where her first job was to compile all of the Navy and Marine facilities on the eastern coast. You can imagine how many that is. Then she was later in charge of the New York harbor, where she gave the codes out to the ships coming in and out of the harbor. The security code, so that they would do that as they came in and left the harbor. And then she went back to being an architect when the war was over, became a very well-known landscape artist. Colorado, to my knowledge, is the only state that had a woman serve in the U.S. Merchant Marines during World War II. Mary Converse was given her captain oars or something right in 1940. She'd been born and raised in Connecticut and Massachusetts and all. And she was in Denver, and once she was named captain, a year or two later, the naval recruiting officer asked her if she would teach their Navy officer candidates seamanship and navigation. So she did that. She used the bird bath in her backyard as a false horizon and taught the classes there in her dining room. Now the U.S. Marine Corps was as coveted for women as it was for Marines, being known as, you know, an elite fighting force. In fact, many women were so anxious to join one of the military branches that they did all sorts of things to qualify. There were women that were overweight. One woman lost 26 pounds and even gained an inch in order to qualify. Interesting how that worked. Other women were underweight. So they would, you know, go to the recruiting office, get weighed, and they're saying, sorry, you know, you don't qualify, you're not 100 pounds or whatever. So they went home and stuffed themselves with bananas and all sorts of food. Other women would get on the scale, still holding their purse in their overcoat. And of course the guy's like, you know, he's not seeing anything. Yep, you're the right weight, you're good. And I'm sure they did that with a lot of men recruits also. So there was one woman from the Fort Collins area that really wanted to be a Marine, but she was only 17. And her father said, no, I'm not going to sign for you. And she finally convinced him. And he was so proud of her that he was a train engineer. He put the service flag in his window of the train, and the fellows would stop and say, oh, Gordy, you've got a son in the military. It's like, no, I have a daughter in the Marine Corps. This was a woman I interviewed, Marie Jansen. She worked out in California at El Centro as a transportation specialist. So those are just some of the vehicles that she drove out there. Now, before I get into women and defense work, I just want to emphasize that for women, the military was quite a change. I know it was a change for a lot of men, too. But for women, they had the extra newness, novelty factor, in that they would go to like Fort Des Moines Cavalry Barracks, and as they were led through, they'd go, well, what's that? And they'd point to a urinal. You know, is that where we brush our teeth? Or we wash our feet after marching? You know, they had no idea. And they're like, no, that's not what you do there. Another woman was told on her first day, tomorrow you're going to clean the latrines. And they said, okay. And they went, I don't know what the latrine is. So they got up the next morning and cleaned the bathrooms, and it worked out okay. And then, of course, you also have the whole idea of the new lingo, you know, the head or the bulkhead, or, you know, all those kinds of things that the military had that, again, men and women, if they didn't have somebody in the military, probably never heard some of that terminology. But women were extremely important. By the end of the war, 19 million women were in the labor force. That was an addition of at least another 6 million from prior to the war. And of course, their jobs would be very different than the jobs they were doing prior to the war. There were domestic servants and nurses and clerks, teachers that quit those jobs and went into the defense plants instead. So in order to encourage these women to do so, they did you know, huge recruiting campaigns. And they would try to point out to women that you can do these jobs because they're very similar to your traditional jobs. So here we have, if you sewed on buttons or made buttonholes on a machine, you can learn to do spot welding on airplane parts. If you've done fine embroidery or made jewelry, you can learn to do assembly on time fuses, radio tubes. if you've used an electric mixer in your kitchen, you can learn to handle a drill press. And the job, you know, was broken down into very specific pieces. So it was easy to train somebody in a week or 2 weeks to weld or something like that. Excuse me. Prior to the war, well, early in 1941, 42, the government asked industry, what do you foresee is going to be the need for female workers as we progress through this war, not knowing how long it's going to take. And so they asked them, you know, what percentage of your women on the production line, not in the offices or anything else, are actually working. This is called fuel and iron, and they did every job. Bricks, coal mining, all of those things. Some women went to other states to work. Curtis Wright did a training program to train women to be engineers. They recruited the women from colleges if they were mathematics majors. Despite this poster showing a white woman, African American women really benefited from a change in civil service. Before the war, you had to submit a photograph to apply. Roosevelt changed that you didn't have to. So African American women really were able to then get jobs in Washington, D.C., working for the federal government. Frances Hale came from Denver right after high school and went out and served in D.C. for the war years. You can see 60% of the women, blacks in the employ of the federal government raised so much, but 60% in administrative or clerical positions versus being the domestic servants in the restrooms and the cafeteria that you would, where they normally would have been. They also recruited women out of college to be code analysts. Perhaps you're familiar with the book Code Girls. And of course, some people say it was Napoleon Bonaparte that said, an army marches on its stomach. Well, as you can imagine, that was really necessary during World War II to increase the amount of agriculture and ranching products that we had available. And again, we were short of help, just like every other farming and ranching community. So trying to employ even more Mexican workers, bringing them up through the Bracero program into Colorado and Texas and California and all. Then you also had people here in Steamboat that took over for their brothers. Lewis Kimry joined the service, left behind his sister Harriet, and told him to take care of things for the parents and the family and the ranch and all. And so that's what she did. Now, they also brought in students in the Palisade and Grand Junction area. They would ask honor students to miss a couple of weeks of school to help in the harvest. And thank you. So, Ann Enstrom spent the first 3 weeks of her senior year pinching the skins off of peaches after they had gone through the steam bath. And she said it got so irritating, all that fuzz makes you itchy. The boys were out in the fields doing the harvesting. And when they were done with the harvest, they went back to school and were required to make up all the work that they had missed. They were not paid for this work. Now, you're probably familiar with the Saturday Evening Post by Norman Rockwell showing Rosie the Riveter. But the picture I really liked that he did for the Saturday Evening Post was September of 1943. And this is called Rosie to the Rescue. All the different jobs, or many of the different jobs that women did. Now, because so many nurses joined the Army Navy Nurse Corps, it left a shortage here on the home front. So the government started the Cadet Nurse Corps, 30-month program. You would apply to, in Colorado, one of 7 nursing schools. If you were accepted, you went through the program, you did a lot of practical work, and then you were required to nurse on the civilian home front. The American Red Cross was extremely important throughout the United States and in Europe and the Pacific. You know, the Nurses Aid Program. This Mae Wilkins here, the blonde, was in Fort Collins and wanted to do something but didn't know if she should get a job or work with the Red Cross or something. She really didn't like uniforms and she didn't like hospitals. But she was so determined to help in the war effort, she joined the Nurses Aid Program and was very proud of herself as she went through the various stages of becoming a full-time nurse's aide. There was another nurse's aide in Denver, and her name was Clara Morse. She lost both of her sons on the USS Arizona, and she found that the work was really the only thing that sustained her. She wrote in her notebook, "After Pearl Harbor, my life was over, or this is the way I felt. I just keep fighting the longing to stop here and go to them. But there is work to be done, and I must not give up. Time to dress now in my dear little Red Cross uniform. How I love it." Then the Red Cross had donut girls overseas, and they took a big converted bus and made it into a place to make coffee and donuts. It had a phonograph at the back so they could play music, and they went throughout France and England and all, serving donuts. This one girl, Eva Christensen, was from Brush, Colorado, and she wrote a diary, and then she was able to sell her parts of her diary to the magazine. And she said at one point that she figured that she made anywhere between 160,000 and 175,000 donuts. She had washed around 60,000 cups, lifted 1,500 coffee urns, carried 2,000 pails of water, wiped the counter 1,300 times, and sifted flour for 580 batches of donuts. So quite a bit. And of course, every community in the United States basically had a Red Cross chapter. There was also USOs. In Denver, there were 3 for the servicemen, 2 for the Negro servicemen, and then also 2 for the women war workers at the various plants. This is kind of a collage of different things that were being done on the home front. Everyone contributed, even children. You had your victory gardens. You had people, paying attention to the rationing and recycling. You have your ration stamps. Of course, nylons and silk. You could basically not get stockings. So originally, women would use makeup to color their legs, and then an eyebrow pencil to draw up the seam. And in fact, Max Factor Jr. made a little device that looked like this, and you would put, one finger, like that, I guess, yeah. And you would put your eyebrow pencil there, and this was like a guideline along and, so you could get it a little bit straight. After a while, you just gave up. And they didn't mess with it. And of course, getting scrap rubber, tin, metal, all those things, lipstick tubes, rubber hoses, all of that were things that were being recycled and rationed, like food and all of that. This is a war sarge. So there were war bonds that were sold. You could buy one for $18.75. 10 years later, you turn it into the government, get $25. So what you're doing is loaning the government money and then getting your interest later. So some people couldn't afford, you know, $18.75 for a $25 savings bond, or $37.50 for $50. So they sold also war bond stamps, and you just put them in a little booklet. When you got $18.70, you threw in another nickel, and you could get the savings bond. So the Ladies' Home Journal at one point published an article that people were making war corsages, using the war bond stamp. They would color it in cellophane, curl it so it looks like a petal, and then add the greenery from you know, a regular nursery or florist, and sell them for the dances and things like that. So people are also supporting the war effort that way. And then Victory Mail, this was a single sheet that you opened up, and you would write on one side, you fold it up, and it would be mailed. If it was going to go to somebody in the Pacific Theater, it went through San Francisco. It's going to the Eastern or European Theater, it went through New York City or Chicago. And there it was opened up, and it was put through a scan machine. And it came out about the size of a regular playing card. That was then boxed, sent overseas. And when it was overseas, it was enlarged to about the size of a postcard, you know, 4 by whatever postcard. The problem is, since it was so small when it first came out, people thought, no, I gotta write tiny. And I don't know. So then when it came out to half the size, it couldn't be read. But the advantage, and you couldn't put anything inside. You know, you couldn't put a lock of hair or a rose petal, or, you know, a picture or something like that. And then a lot of women would seal their mail with a kiss. Well, they left lipstick on the V-mail, and it jammed up the machine. But the advantage to V-mail is it was quicker, and it also saved so much room. You can imagine that something the size of playing cards versus bulky mail. You know, they said that you could put the equivalent, like, or 10 or 15 of those huge bags, you know, mail bags, into something like one size. You could fit all of those. So you're just really reducing. Now you can fit more armaments. You can fit more Navy and Army nurses on those transports. You can put more food and all those other kinds of things. By the end of the war, people were thinking, you know, we want the women to leave the plants. We don't need them there anymore. They will be more than glad to leave. And many of them were more than glad to leave. But studies at the time, surveys showed that a lot of women wanted to stay. You know, they were earning good money. They found a sense of purpose and independence. They, you know, ended up meeting all these different people that they might have never met before. But once the war was over, the plants were pretty much shut down. The Federal Center became the Federal Center and not the Denver Ordinance plant. By September of 1945, there was just a skeleton crew, about 200 workers, whereas at one point it had 20,000. The women who did end up going back once it became the Federal Center, of course, went back in the skirts of the stenographer and the typist and the personnel working for those various federal agencies. I found in interviewing these women that the war really made an impact on their lives, that they ended up raising their children differently than perhaps if the war and their war work had not occurred. Most of them have been very open about telling things. However, sometimes it takes longer to get the whole story. As I said, I'm friends with Leela, and I've seen her, you know, a couple times a year since I met her in 2014. And just recently I found out that she had been injured during the war. And she's like, oh yeah, you know, I don't want to tell you about those kinds of things. So it's interesting, and I know the story is often the same way for our male veterans. And so it's been very humbling to be able to interview these people and hear their stories, and hopefully to be able to share them with the public. So sorry about my loss of the throat there, and thank you so much, and thank you for listening.
Can you do questions?
I can do questions.
Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yes, sir.
Did any women actually see combat? during World War II?
They did not see combat as in being on a front line, but there were women that were killed. There were women that were captured. The Philippines was captured fairly soon after Pearl Harbor, and we already had Navy nurses there. They had been there since before World War I, because we had military bases on the Philippines, and they were captured. And almost 70 of them were captured and held for 3 years. So they saw that. They were under extreme conditions in the prison camp. They were down to, half a cup of rice, and then it was a quarter of a cup of rice, and then it wasn't until rice the next day, sort of thing. They were in that. There were Army nurses that were on hospital ships, marked with the big red hospital X, that were bombed by the Germans and the Italians, and they were killed. So I'm not sure the number of nurses, I want to say maybe 38 or so that were killed from that. And there were some that died on the evacuation flights, especially in Europe, flying over the Alps and things like that. So they saw combat in that the combat came to them, I guess. They didn't go to the combat. There was one woman, I read her interview, and she was in a tent at night, sleeping, and she heard something, so she got up and walked out. When she came back, there was a huge piece of shrapnel right through her collar. So those kinds of things did occur. And women did die of malaria and the tropic diseases that, of course, hit the men really hard in the Philippines and other parts of the Pacific. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, yeah, there's more.
Yes.
So, can you talk a little bit about the interviewing these nurses, interviewing these women, what that was like? How you interviewed them, and what did it feel like to talk with these women?
Okay. Yes. I do a Rosie the Riveter character. The Denver Ordinance plan I had found out when I was doing a master's program, a former teacher. And so when I wanted to present the home front to my students, I decided to be this composite bullet maker. And so I've done this throughout the state and out of state. And I did one at Loveland Airport, and this Army nurse, Leela, came up to me and said, I liked it, but you didn't say anything about the Army nurses. And I thought, well, yeah, because I don't even really know about the Army nurses, I was concentrating on the home front predominantly. I would mention, that women joined the WACs or the Waves or something, but I didn't. And I said, I really don't know anything. Can I interview you? And she said, sure. So I interviewed her, as I said several times. So I brought a recorder. I, recorded word for word the questions I asked her. And then I would transcribe it, which was painful, or I'd pay some friends to transcribe it word for word. I would give the interviewee a DVD of it, as well as a written transcript for their families. And so I had sets of questions that I would ask, and oftentimes, I would say, if I knew ahead of time that I was going to interview them, if you have any pictures or you have any memorabilia from the war. And so they would bring out newspaper articles. One woman invented something at a template factory thing. And so she brought out the newspaper article where she won a prize for it. Others brought out their old uniforms. And these women opened their doors. I mean, they didn't know me from anybody. I would give a presentation like this, and or Rosie, and somebody would say, oh, I worked at such and such. I worked at the Denver Ordinance plant. I'm like, can I interview you? Don't leave. And they would just open up their doors, and they just, they were great. They were wonderful. Several men I interviewed. Peggy Moynihan had passed away in Montrose before I had a chance to interview her, but her husband was more than happy to pull out her gold medal and all of this other. So that was the process I went through. There's also, the Library of Congress has the Veterans Oral History Project that has thousands and thousands of oral histories from World War II, men and women. And some of them are digitized so you can read them online or listen to them online. Others, I went to Washington, D.C. and was able to look at some and all of that. Obviously the museums and the historical societies have been very valuable in different things. And one woman I interviewed said, I know a woman that I met at my hairdresser, and she was a code analysis. And I said, do you know who she is? And she said, I have her number here somewhere. She found it, gave it to me, and I ended up interviewing this Nancy Thompson, who is still alive. So it was just, it was so humbling, you know, to hear of women that went through Buchenwald and saw the concentration camp, was led by a Polish survivor, and you know, standing in their army boots in this much mud, operating, or you know, doing the pre-operation shock tent and things like that. I had no clue of all the different work that women did, not only in the military, but also outside. You know, women who worked at the Denver Ordinance plant. One woman, her sister, she was a secretary, and her sister wanted to work there, so she got her a job as a secretary, saying, oh, she's great, she's great. So she got the job. Well, her sister was not great. Her sister would take dictation and just write down as much as she could, because she didn't know shorthand. Go home and try to tell her sister what happened, and they would type the letter that night and then bring it back the next day. And so finally, there was an opening on the floor, and she got a job there, and she said, this is great. I'm getting paid more, I don't have to fake it, and I don't have to wear dresses. And so she was so happy to be able to do those kind of things. Did that answer your question? Okay, yeah. So,
Yeah. So that's just a precursor. If you love it, you can read even more, because it's a fascinating read, and there's a lot more, and it's laid out similarly. So these books are for sale. We have some here too. I think they're all hard copy or hard.
yeah, it hasn't come out
cover,
otherwise.
and you can have Gail sign it. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
So, if you were going to be in character for Rosie, give us an example. What would you do?
If I were to be Rosie right now, oh, well, I would have the ration stamps to show you. I would actually have a picture frame that I riveted, that I learned how to do. And then ration stamps, I would tell you all about, you know, the ration stamps and how they worked, and show you copies of it. I would read a letter from my brother Mark, who's serving overseas as a navigator, and about my little nephew that I'm taking care of and taking around to do recycling with his little radio flyer wagon, things like that. And of course I would be in garb.
Yes.
That's what I was going to say. What would you look like?
Yeah, I would look like Rosie. Yeah, I wouldn't look like this. And I have a floor-length 1930s radio as a prop, and that always brings in lots of comments. You know, 'cause a lot of people had those in their homes for so long. Yeah. Again, thank you very much.